157 days. That's how long BattleTech settings' single largest war crime would take place. 157 days, a little bit more than 5 months or so of time for the single, perhaps worst act to unfold during the First Succession War. Now, the Succession Wars were all terrible, and especially the first was particularly bad. I would argue to say the First Succession War is the worst of the bunch because we have all of the toys, all the technology at the Interstellar's disposal. There is no technological regression or logistical loss of supplies or anything like that to happen yet. So you can go full tilt into the enemy, and indeed they did. So for something to stand out amongst this, it's got to be particularly bad. What's up, everybody? I'm James. Welcome to Mechanical Mayhem. Centauri's 4 is the subject of discussion, and is the Centauri's massacre that I am referring to. That time when the Draconis Combine was basically putting an entire world to the sword, and in some cases, quite literally. So, what could warrant the order to execute an entire planetary population? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the build-up, what happened, and the aftermath for the largest single war crime in human history for the BattleTech setting, the Centauri's Massacre. As mentioned, this happened during the First Succession War. It would take place starting in 2796 in September and would run all the way till February 2797. And it started with a single bullet. You see, in the First Succession War, the Draconis Combine was digging hard into Federated Suns territory. They definitely fought hard and gained ground, but it came at the cost of their logistical supply line, their supply chain. It was being stretched thin. And with the destruction of New Roads 3's supply depot for Draconis Combine, they wouldn't be able to continue their push to drive their sword into New Avalon. But they were only one jump away from being able to get to New Avalon's, the system of New Avalon. And that's not good, because that is the capital system of the Federated Suns, so that's bad for them. But that's how close the Draconis Combine was managed to get during the First Succession War. The Federated Suns were on their heels. The Curitan war machine was definitely putting in work, but they simply couldn't push any further. They had to gather their supplies, gather their forces, have a mustering point, right? Have a forward operating base to be able to push to New Avalon. And Centauri's 4 was chosen, a world that they did conquer, and would be the site of this forward operating base. And so important was this base that the coordinator of worlds himself, also simply known as just the coordinator, Minoru Kurita of House Kurita, would personally oversee the construction of this forward operating base. Now, the title of coordinator in Draconis Combine is the head of state for the Draconis Combine, the leader. So the big guy himself, the head cheese, is present on Centauri's 4 to oversee this base. That's a big deal. Now, of course, you're going to want to keep your head of state safe. Now, in BattleTech, your heads of state tend to be pretty competent and capable. That was a weird way to say competent, by the way, but competent and capable mech warriors in their own right. And Minoru Kurita was known to pilot a Battlemaster, and indeed his Battlemaster was present on Centauri's 4. But that's not where he would meet his end, because yes, his end is what causes this massacre to happen. You see, instead, he would be on foot, with a small retinue of troops around him and a Buddhist priest. That is where he would meet his end. Why? Why would he do this? Well, firstly, we have to understand that any remaining real military threat from the Federated Suns were pushed back to a single continent, not near the town of New Snowfield, which is where Minoru Kurita was just outside of. And Minoru Kurita, I guess, is an old soul, if you will, because he was taken by the beauty of the scenery around him and wanted to experience it. That seems noble. And so he would, with a small retinue of troops and one Buddhist priest. And it is in this moment that he would be shot in the back by Latha Pichel, a assassin sharpshooter from the 7th Crucius Lancers. Kind of proving not safe enough, I suppose. Now, he had no idea who he took out. The reason for this is because the person he took out was wearing a standard Draconis Combine military uniform with a colonel's insignia on it. So, in his mind, he took out a colonel of the Draconis Combine. A decent target, to be sure, but nothing more. You see, Minoru Kurita, that's how he dressed. I suspect it was maybe eavesdrop on his own personnel around him, and also to ward off this very thing. Because if you're in a crowd of Draconis Combine forces, a colonel isn't necessarily the big go-to, right? You want the biggest cheese you can find, and chances are in a standards type of gathering, there will be a bigger cheese than that colonel. However, when you're by yourself, you with a retinue of standard soldiers and a priest, you are a Buddhist priest. You are the big cheese. So it did not work here. However, word travels, and when the High Command of the Federated Sons found this out and verified it, First Prince John Davion would act very quickly. Because while yes, Minoru Kurita was his enemy, his opponent, he was stable. Unlike the successor, Minoru Kurita's son, Jinjiro Kurita, who was known to be particularly violent of character and volatile of nature. A complete loose cannon. Not the person you want to deal with on the best of times, and the circumstances leading to his elevation to coordinator were not the best of times. So in acting quickly, Prince Davion would recall any remaining forces, order them to fall back off of Kintari's 4 ASAP before Jinjiro would get there. The thinking was, militaristically, that there would be no targets. So Jinjiro would just flail about, maybe whip his own soldiers into shape, have them build this base in record-setting time or something, but it would spare the soldiers, and the Federated Sons needed everybody they could get because they were kind of viewed to be on the verge of collapse at this time. So when Jinjiro made planetfall, the Federated Sons forces did manage to evacuate beforehand, including that assassin. But it doesn't matter because after Jinjiro made planetfall, he would calmly, quietly, and with authority order one particular 3-word order. Simply put, kill them all. Now, that's insane, and clearly one of his generals thought that, deeply enough to actually voice his concern and question this order, and was promptly executed for questioning the order. Well, that sends a message executing in general. Clearly, Jinjiro's here to play ball, so he says, jump, we're going to jump, and this will begin the 157 days of executing a planetary population. Let that sink in a little bit. We're talking about 157 days. Just about 5 months to 6 months or so, right? This is day in and day out, no sick time, no off time. If you're a civilian population member, you are just trying to live. You're going to try and keep an eye out for where the Draconis Combine forces are, and you're going to evacuate. You can do whatever you can to not be caught, because the order is kill them all. And I'm sure the first few mass executions were horrendously devastating, because I very much doubt this order was broadcasted for the civilian population to hear. So all of a sudden, you're going to have a bunch of people rounded up and then no longer seen again. And then word travels fast, the panic and the terror sets in, and you got to stay alive. To be fair, Jinjiro Kurita's forces are not robots. And while some would kind of revel in the slaughter, as it were, unfortunately, because the human condition is a messed up one, many will be broken by that command and the Kintari's massacre that would be unfolding before them. Many a soldier would break. And this would lead to, over time, many soldiers, whenever they could, overlooking the civilians they found. If they stormed a building and found a group of civilians, they just pretend like they never saw them, or they would take them and throw them into hiding somewhere that maybe they already swept and wouldn't go back to again. Something so they wouldn't have to carry out this horrendous order, and everybody got to live another day. Um, that's particularly devastating. That's pretty grim, right? It's pretty grim, dark, just about as an event as opposed to a whole setting. Now, with that said, other soldiers were particularly volatile, depraved, loose cannons, just like Jinjiro Kurita, and I'm not picking on the Draconis Combine for this. Every faction is going to have those loose cannons and those depraved individuals. Just, you know, when you give them an avenue to revel in it, it's particularly disturbing. So, Tsunoshi Oshita led a recon lance of Wasp mechs, and they would be some of the most well-known of the just butchers of Kentaris, because that lance would seek out civilian population centers that are particularly dense, difficult to evacuate in general, and then they would systematically target immediately things like apartment building high-rises, because it's hard to evacuate out of those, and they could stomp their mechs through them, even though they're light mechs. And also things like hospitals, because you can't really evacuate that stuff that quickly. And would do the same thing. But fate would have it that this lance would meet its end shortly thereafter, when the Kataris massacre concluded, because they would get a bounty on their heads, and it would be collected just a little bit after the end of the Kataris massacre. So a little bit of vengeance for the people in Kentaris there. Now, with that being said, we do have Jinjiro Kurita personally overseeing several of these mass executions because he's insane. But also, to up the ante and utterly break everybody involved because they're not robotic or heinous like he is, he would issue an order. This order would make the soldiers put the world to the sword quite literally, because it forbid the use of modern technology, meaning that katana on their side, that is how they have to execute the population. And that's going to break your soldiers even more so than just day in, day out, wholesale, wanton slaughter of a human population that doesn't deserve it, right? So now you have to do it with your sword only. That's visceral. That's up close. That's going to ruin you. And indeed, it ruined many a Draconis Combine soldier. In any case, the Buddhist priest would go up to Jinjiro Kurita and beg and plead for him to stop this genocide. This is the same Buddhist priest that was present when his father, Minoru Kurita, was taken out. Not only would Jinjiro entertain none of that, but Jinjiro would stab this Buddhist priest and leave him to die with the rest. What a callous individual, right? It's a monster in human flesh. Well, after that turn of events and the putting to the sword quite literally, and these mechs doing their atrocities and everything else, the daimyo HQ vehicle of Jinjiro Kurita's would, the staff therein, anytime Jinjiro Kurita was not present because he was personally overseeing these executions, they would smuggle information and recordings, just anything they could to get the word out there what was going on to Comstar to broadcast on the HPG, and indeed they would. Now, Comstar's personnel were not exempt from this 3-word order to kill them all. In fact, alongside the civilian population, a lot of the Comstar staff present on Kentaris 4 would also be butchered, which is kind of a bold, insane move when you think about it and how Comstar is, but just shows the depravity of Jinjiro Kurita. But to the credit of the, I guess you call it the director on site, or the commander for the Comstar on site, he would never stop broadcasting the information out there, even though orders were dropped down to do so. He made sure the word got out. Now, it's unclear if this had any real impact on Denjiro's creator's decision to leave when he did, but what we do know is that once he found out about the HQ vehicle's actions, the crew's actions of that vehicle, he would have his bodyguard, the Otomo, execute them all. Now, with that said, after 157 days, the Denjiro creator would leave this world and the massacring would stop, with the end result being over 90% of the civilian population was wiped out. Think about that for a second. Imagine 90% of where you live suddenly, in terms of people, suddenly no longer being there. They're not somewhere else, they're no longer around, period. That's, and lunacy. That's awful, right? Well, that's the world of Kentares at that moment. So what happened after this? Because you can't just have the murder of an entire populace just about be the end all of stuff. Clearly this is going to snowball. Well, it does, because many of the soldiers that were present and committed these acts and atrocities would throw themselves on their own swords and end it for themselves, unable to bear the weight of that shame and that guilt. Like I said, sure, the civilians got the worst of it, but the soldiers were definitely also victims to a degree as well, because they had to follow these orders, because it came from the top of the top, and to not follow it was death, right? I mean, a general was executed for questioning it. You're just a foot soldier, what are you going to do, right? So many of them would end up ending themselves as well, unfortunately. The Aerodani Light Horse mercenary unit that was currently in a contract with House Kurita, while not present at Kentares 4 at all, was so horrified by the events that they would learn about that they would breach their own contract and end it to leave. And this would result in a microcosm of a slaughter for them, because their retainers and their staff and whatnot would be targeted because they refused to surrender and stay. And yet they would persevere and survive and make it out of there and go to the Free Worlds League to continue on their mercenariness. If you're wondering why it's a mercenary unit, well, the Aerodani Light Horse originally came from Star League, and they're cut from a bit of a different cloth, you could say. They have higher standards, and they have an idea of honor and integrity, and this rankled against all of that, more or less. So they would do that. So that is a loss of a particularly well-renowned mercenary unit for the Draconis Combine. A loss of the military personnel in terms of a lot of them ending themselves, and those that didn't would be so demoralized by the events that unfolded, and it kind of had a chain effect, because even soldiers that were not present on Kentares would feel that blow of a morale blow to an extent as well, because of just how atrocious it was to actually happen. When you combine that with the Federated Sons getting their second win and being emboldened and completely and utterly locked in now to punish the Draconis Combine and get vengeance, you have a force that was looked to be on the verge of collapse suddenly kind of rebound, gain their resolve back, and push back the Draconis Combine eventually all the way back to their pre-war borders, effectively saving the Federated Sons, you could say. Who knows what would have happened if they actually launched an attack on New Avalon. So you have that as well. And unfortunately, the assassin, the sharpshooter that took the shot that ended the original coordinator's life, or the first coordinator's life in this particular instance for the Draconis Combine, Minoru Kurita, would not be able to live with the weight and the guilt for what happened because of his actions, even though he had no idea who it was, and he would end up ending himself as well. But such an event is going to have ripples like that, unfortunately. Now, Kentares would eventually rebuild, and on the first Friday of every October for Kentares 4, it would be basically Kentares Day, where they would have memorial services everywhere, and those particular services would persist on for 3 days, followed by another week's worth of mourning for such an atrocity, and that would happen every year, as you can never forget what happened on Kentaris. Clearly, not a big fan of the Draconis Combine there, and indeed, this world would kind of be a big stain on Draconis Combine's track record, amongst others, to be sure. But something that they won't ever really, truly get away from. So, with that said, that is the aftermath of what would happen with the Qataris for Massacre. Ultimately, the Faraday Sons would be able to push back the Draconis Combine, and the borders would more or less be back to where they were, and both great houses would exist. Jujiro Kurita would go on to continue leading the Draconis Combine, and Qataris 4 would eventually rebuild. Now, one last thing of note. Qataris lost over 90% of its population. But the total, I guess you could say, the total number of those executed is actually less than the total number of deaths that occurred in World War II. And we're talking about an entire planetary population. It doesn't make it any better. World War II was a particularly devastating war after all. But my point is that I deliberately withheld the actual number in talking about it because I wanted to let you kind of stew and simmer on this 90% over 90% concept. And chances are, the number you're thinking in your head is probably a good deal higher than the actual number in the lore. And I think this is part and parcel to worlds being almost like provinces or states, and the Great House and the nation of, let's say, the Draconis Combine or the Federated Sons or what have you, are the country. So, therefore, these worlds don't have to have or do not have quite the same population density and size that you would expect based on just our own experience of planet Earth, if that made any sense. But that's just my own personal speculation as to why it's like this. BattleTech isn't the only setting that has kind of a low population count on worlds either, mind you. I just figured I'd throw that out there. So what's the actual number? Well, the lore states over 50 to 52, even over 52 million. And I don't want to say that's it, because in the grand scheme of things of how atrocious this concept would be if it were real, and it's just an atrocity to even think about, even in a fictional sense. But at the same notion, definitely would have expected a higher casualty count just by hearing percentages alone. So let me know, if you didn't know this bit of lore, what is the number that was in your head for over 90% of a population? Because it's 50 to 52 plus million, which is still horrendous. In any case, that is the atrocity that was the Qataris Massacre, a particularly dark stain in the timeline of the BattleTech universe, and one of those things that really emphasizes the horrors of the First Succession War in particular. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your day to tune in and stop by. I really appreciate it, especially if you've made it all the way here. Consider alpha striking that subscribe button to be part of future conversations as well. And until next time, take care.